Dr. Aaron Parrett is a professor of literature at the University of Providence, and he has participated in collaborative projects with Peter Koch from an early time, including writing essays in his catalog Resonate and working with him on a variety of different projects. And having said that, I'm going to go ahead and bring Aaron up to the front here. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm really grateful to Paris, Gibson, and Nicole and Sarah for putting this on. It's great to be in Great Falls, and I have to also give a shout out to my first boss, who is responsible partly for my love of books, Jim Heckel, library director down in Helena. Probably corrupted me when he said, yeah, you can sort all the new donations and keep whatever you'd like. So that started my love of books. In the span of his 70-something years on planet Earth, Peter Koch has witnessed the coming of age in his home state of Montana. Slow emergence from, I would describe it as a self-imposed immaturity of the Montana face. I don't know if you're familiar with that essay by Leslie Fiedler. Eloquently cataloged by Leslie Fiedler. To its ascendancy as what people like to describe as the last best place. And as the descendant of one of the Montana pioneers, Peter Gillenberg, is that how you say that? Koch, who helped found the university down in Bozeman, Peter inherited the inside knowledge of how Indian lands were colonized, and how rustic European values were laid down over the crude maps first sketched by fur trappers and gold miners. How civilization's thin veneer has only recently colored this remote region of the country and is forever being eroded away by the acid iniquities of developers and politicians. In the course of a half century, he's put his knowledge to good use in creating a body of work that is at once a showcase of the book arts, the art preservative of all art, as they say. And he has also made a compelling philosophical commentary on his home state. And so today I want to talk about Peter's place in the intellectual and artistic history of Montana, at least as I see it in my idiosyncratic way. It's also worth remembering at the outset that, like other intellectuals and artists before him, I think of Ovid, who was exiled from Rome to the Black Sea, or James Joyce, who helped give Ireland a modern identity from his exile in Paris and Trieste. Peter Koch's perspective happens to be that of the former insider looking back in from the outside, from his own self-imposed exile in Berkeley, California. And his return here today, in some sense, as a homecoming, and surely coming home must jog Peter's memory of his own beginnings as a printer down there at the Blackstone Press on 3rd Street in Missoula, where Bernice's Bakery is now, if you are. And though he lives in California, he inhabits, and I would say is inhabited by Montana, haunted, you might even say, much in the way that another one of his mentors famously said, "I am haunted by water." After earning a degree in philosophy from the University of Montana in the 1970s, Koch somewhat counterintuitively chose to devote his life to documenting Montana and all that it means in pursuit of an antiquated and some would say obsolete technology, letterpress printing. And along the way, he's become world-renowned as one of the masters of printing and the book arts. And you're all familiar with his singular books. And if not, I can't think of a better place to get acquainted than right next door. They've put together an excellent exhibition spanning most of his career over there. And he is a printer and an artist, but I've always thought of him since the moment I first met him as a philosopher, really, and a philosopher of Montana in the tradition of Diogenes, maybe, the guy who famously carried a lamp around to illuminate the shadowy recesses of the world around him. A philosopher whose medium has not been the writing of words so much as the printing of words. And I think he learned early on to appreciate beyond the semantic value of words, the visual appearance of text on the page arranged in a beautiful way with appropriate typeface and illustration and ornament. And I think he also learned at the knees of his grandfather Ehlers, who was a pretty famous Montana author of The High Trail and 40 Years a Forester, and also his neighbor in Missoula, Leslie Fiedler, the great Montana literary critic. After traveling the world as a young man and experiencing what we might call a spiritual epiphany in Tangiers, I think I have that right, he settled down to study and to value and revere the way books are made, the way in which letters and images can be presented beautifully on the page. And he learned under the auspices of his mentors and colleagues in the world of letterpress printing that he would soon dive into in the 1970s to appreciate, as Marshall McLuhan said, nobody remembers this guy, but he said, the medium is the message. And that the presence of ideas and words on the page, as you'll see showcased in his text next door, I think that summarizes the moment at which he realized what he needed to do. So in a sense, to engage with Peter Koch, or to examine his work, is, in my mind, to do philosophy, since his books and prints beget the sort of intercourse that requires one to think, and to think in specific ways. And the three traditional branches of philosophy are ontology, the study of being, metaphysics, and ethics. And I think his artifacts require a reader to think about the ontology of the book, the being of a book as an object, but also to reflect on the metaphysics of meaning. And then finally to investigate the ethics of human production. And I think that's where he's at most recently. So in this analogy, Peter Koch is the Socrates of the book world. And we are all the youth of Athens happily accompanying him into the agora of his studio, or the Codex Book Fair, or this exhibition at Paris Gibson in Great Falls, Montana. And so I propose that the way to understand his contributions to the world of books and book arts is to catalog them in the Dewey Decimal System, not in the 700s with the art, it is 700s, right? But with the 100s, the philosophy. So what he has been up to for the last half century, in my mind, is a robust philosophical investigation that uses the techniques of letterpress printing rather than the stolid and stupefying jargon of logic and academic philosophy. And like Henry Bugbee, who was a professor at U of M where he went, or Leslie Fiedler, I think Peter Koch interrogates our concepts of being. He interrogates our concept of meaning and truth. So I would call that the Montana metaphysics. And he articulates in his ink-stained way an ethics for how to approach the future. And I think he is doing the work of philosophy, a peculiar kind of Montana philosophy, and you'll see Montana in all of his works. Using the tools of printing as an artistic undertaking, and I think one of the results of that has been the discovery of who we are here in Montana beyond the whole place narrative stuff. Perhaps a specific case, as Wittgenstein would say, of who we are as human beings. And so I want to emphasize that the ethics are especially relevant in the Montana connection because of the Extraction Project, which explores the intersection of human art and our destructive or extractive impact on the environment. And Montana, as you know, with its ever-increasing plagues of forest fires and dwindling fisheries, happens to be one of those places where the effects are felt most keenly. So here's another way, though, I think of him as a philosopher. And if you know him, I think you'll understand this. Carl Jaspers once said that about St. Augustine, that he thinks in questions. And I think this is true of Peter's work also, not just the artifacts, the books he makes, but also in the form of his cocktail parties and dinners hosted by he and his wife Susan, or in the form of his grand convocational projects like Codex, but also in the form of every conversation he's ever had with friends and colleagues. He really thinks in questions, the scope of his queries ranging from what if we do this thing, or why do you suppose it's like this? And the thing about talking to Peter is it's really always having a conversation in that behind every declarative sentence he utters, there's the echo of a question, like what might this mean? Or where are we headed with this? In other words, the way you know someone is thinking hard about a subject and think seriously about the world is they, in honesty, tend to punctuate their sentences with, I don't know. And if you have a conversation with Peter, you'll hear him say, I don't know a lot. I don't know, but. Not that he doesn't have a lot of confirmed opinions and convictions. I don't mean that he waffles on the fundamentals. I just mean that he's in constant investigation of the world around him. And Aristotle famously said that philosophy starts wherever there is taumat sayan, the sense of wonder. And more than anything, I think this principle is what I see operating behind every spectacular book he's made. He's a sincere and earnest sense of wonder. And that sense of wonder tends to lead the best scientists, mathematicians, artists, and philosophers to the most fruitful and interesting results. And perhaps more importantly, ensures that the difficult and taxing work along the way will involve a certain measure of fun. Take the Codex Book Fair as an example. This is an enterprise that changed the landscape of the book arts, I think, internationally. And if you've ever been to a book arts fair, especially Codex, you know that the participants are among the most conscientious and serious artisans on the planet. They're very serious about their work. And yet, the festival itself exudes this spirit of fun and goodwill. I would call it unadulterated fun. And in this, I think Peter follows the injunction of Plato, probably the most famous of philosophers, who in one of his letters confided to his friends that everything else aside, philosophy should always be pursued, and this is his quote, with the seriousness we had as children at play. And if you are around children much, you realize they really take it seriously when they play. It seems to me that Peter Koch operates almost always in this spirit of taumatsein, the sense of wonder. And his sense of wonder is contagious. He loves nothing more than to collaborate with others he finds interesting, poets, librarians, famous chefs, musicians, novelists, 60s radicals from Berkeley, and other printers. And he loves to connect people the way I imagine Socrates did, wandering the agora, thinking out loud, smiling, and asking questions. And this, I insist, is the business of philosophy in the pure sense, as the Greeks conceived of it, the love of wisdom. What does this all have to do with Montana? I think, whereas most Montana writers and artists seem obsessed with the notion of place, I think Peter has instead devoted his work to pursuing what's underneath the place, the being, the way Heidegger did, another philosopher, Dasein, the being there, or maybe the way another philosopher, Duns Scotus, thought of it in terms of quiddity, the thisness of things. So there's a real palpable sense of this being that I think translates into a book, which is a palpable object that you manipulate with your hands. There's a there. So what I mean to say is that Montana figures as a place in Koch's imagination, as it surely must for anyone who lives here. But I think what he's after in the production of his books is the stuff that lies beneath all that, the substance of things and ideas. And naturally, this takes on palpable forms. And one of my favorite stories about him is in 1973, he went up to Fairfield, Montana, just up the road here, and picked up the remnants of the newspaper type in an old C&P Platen press. And I think he confessed to me he knew nothing about any of it, just knew that's what he was going to do. And started printing over in Missoula with it. And so to me, this is what's called applied philosophy. It's not, people sitting around in an ivory tower thinking about things. It's actually doing something. And so I guess in the pure sense of what I mean, academic debates about Marxism are one thing, and intellectuals, especially in my academic community, love to talk about Marxism in the abstract. But actually going out and acquiring the means of production is a whole other thing. And cynically, somebody else said, freedom of the press only applies to people who own a press. And so this brings me to the metaphysical part of this. And this has always been the most interesting part of his work for me. And that's the way he questions and interrogates the basic ways in which we encounter the world, or a work of art, or a book that is a work of art. And another philosopher, Hegel, observed that Wesen ist, was gewesen ist, meaning the essence of a thing is what has already been. And since the Greeks, philosophers have distinguished between being and becoming. This is an ancient debate in philosophy. Between what is unfolding and what has already happened or unfolded, and what is accomplished through that process. And before the invention of writing systems, this distinction might not have made much of a difference to people. Before they were able to preserve their words and statements in written form, all reality must have been more fluid, since our speech, like music itself, is ephemeral. It vanishes as quickly as our words are uttered. Writing, of course, changed everything. Now we can impose being on becoming. So when you're talking, it's just, you don't even have to really think about it. Words just flow out of you. But once you put them to paper, then you suddenly have to stop and think about it because they're going to be preserved. It's now a thing. It has being. And with this, the evanescent mystery of thought emerging through speech could be translated into a permanent record. And we could make shrines and idols of our thoughts and ideas which could be passed around intact. And language and the mastery of systems to represent it made humanity what it is and has become. So a big part of our being is the fact that we have language and can preserve it. And in many ways, Peter Koch's work constantly reminds me, at least, of this simple truth. The essence of humanity is what we have produced, for good or evil. And his Urtext project next door, the 3 volumes of that, to me, illustrates this as succinctly as anything that I can think of. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Printing is called the art preservative of all art. And I think that's true without question, but the philosophical import of that motto goes way beyond its obvious truth as an observation about the value of archiving beauty. In my mind, printing captures consciousness itself sort of in the act. And the printed word arrests the transitory insights of the thinker and delivers them to the future. Essence might be what has been, but once that insight is printed in a book, it erases time in a kind of real sense and gives the ideas themselves an existence beyond the thinker. Incidentally, it's worth pointing out that for this reason, Plato was very suspicious of writing. Like a canny lawyer or a venal politician, Plato did not want to put things in writing because he didn't want to be called to account later. And yet, here we are 2,500 years later, calling him to account for what he wrote. And that's because he did write it down. And this leads me to what I think is one of Peter's most important productions, most recent, the Speculum Mundi, which means, a mirror of the world. And to me, this is sort of the epitome of this philosophical endeavor with the book, that it's a self-reflective compendium of human enterprise laid out in book form. And it really does cover everything from religion to the nuclear bomb. But it's more than your typical book, or even your typical letterpress book, if such a thing exists, because in a sense it's the Liber Librorum, the book of all books, a book of all books that pays homage to the idea of the book itself as the most spectacular housing for human consciousness ever devised. It's a Borgesian delight, a veritable library of Babel that envisions our loftiest ambitions and our darkest horrors connected telescope fashion as part of a continuum. And at one end you can think of, Dante's Inferno going down, and then the Paradiso headed up to heaven. Or, if you're familiar with science fiction, this guy Ted Chiang's Tower of Babylon story, in which travelers who have sedulously climbed the Tower of Babel to pierce the vault of heaven find themselves transported by a wormhole back to right where they started. Which reminded me of T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets, who observes this: What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning, and the end is where we start from. And every phrase and sentence that is right, where every word is at home, taking its place to support the others, the word neither diffident nor ostentatious, an easy commerce of the old and the new, the common word exact without vulgarity, the formal word precise but not pedantic, the complete consort dancing together. To my mind, is about as succinct a summary of letterpress in general, but the stuff that Peter is up to, especially with the Speculum Mundi. And it's not by accident that he chose as his printer's mark, so you'll see this on the spines of the books, the little Greek snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. The mysterious point of origin and the point to which his efforts always return, his personal omphalos, navel of the world, as it were, for Peter Koch, is always Montana. And to me, that's the connection. The locus of his own conception, this place is the incubator of his incunabula. The last best place is where the owl of Minerva returns to roost in the rafters of the print shop. But now, with the Speculum Mundi, the subject matter for the book of all books is humanity's own self-conscious yearning for the heavens. Not merely our many towers of Babel, but also think of Dante's Paradiso again, coupled with the diabolical alter ego that humanity seems to have, which is this impulse for self-destruction on a grand scale. And I don't mean merely Dante's Inferno, but the technological prowess we've acquired along the way to harness the power of the sun, that is, in a word, the nuclear bomb. This is in the Speculum Mundi also. So in a sense, that nuclear bomb represents the epitome of human striving. It's an amazing engineering accomplishment at the cutting edge of what human beings can grasp about the being of the universe. The mastery of matter itself, splitting that which was never meant to be cut. Atom in Greek means uncuttable. And then here we go and cut it. And the bomb, at the same time, is an ontological nightmare, if you will, because intervening into the basis of being itself requires us to reconsider those words. It's uncuttable, but then we devise a way to cut it and make what many people would regard as doom incarnate. And it's also not lost on me that we're surrounded right now by all kinds of nuclear weapons. But the end is in the beginning, and Peter's Speculum Mundi reveals the totality of human endeavor, includes both the invention of beautiful art, but also the specter of total annihilation. And one of the exhibits over there is the Speculum Mundi open to the, what is the thing called that measures? Right, the volvel that determines how likely you are to survive, how far from the blast. Before the invention of movable type, but long after the realization of the book, human beings had already set for themselves the task of trying to capture the sum total of human knowledge and human endeavor. And because I'm a college professor, I remind students that if you got a BA in 1500, it meant you were a master of all human knowledge up to that point. And now you not only get a major, but you specialize in a very narrow sliver of whatever that major is. But until very recently, people really thought you could archive all human knowledge. And already in the 13th century, so before even printing was invented, there was a book that, to my mind, is kind of parallel to the Speculum Mundi, called Speculum Maius, or the Greater Mirror. And this was a handwritten book in which this monk in the 13th century wanted to write down everything that human beings knew. And like the guy's name was de Beauvais, Koch's Speculum Mundi also happens to consist of 3 parts. And, well, the urtext consists of 3 parts, of which the Speculum Mundi is the central core. And I don't think this was attempted again until the 18th century when Denis Diderot tried to encyclopedize all human knowledge. And they got to 18 volumes and then realized we're probably never going to finish this. And it hasn't been finished. And I have to put in a word here about Wikipedia, which to me is trying to do the same thing and surely has gone much further, and for the people who sort of criticize Wikipedia, somebody recently did a study and compared errors in Wikipedia with errors in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and there's way more errors in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Part of the reason for that is that Wikipedia is open source and constantly self-correcting, like the scientific method itself. Anyway, I think Koch's ambition is different from the encyclopedists, because his speculum is a mirror held up to the world not to reflect completeness or plenitude, but rather to probe. It's the probing mirror of the pathologist, an instrument designed to provide an illuminated reflection of the human condition, especially as it presents in the last stages of the Anthropocene, the age we live in, the so-called age of the human. And I also want to point out that the word mundi in Latin, the genitive singular of mundus, is the world, but it's the world as conceived in distinctly human terms, so not the earth, which would be terus. And in doing the etymology for the word mundus, I found out that one line of it traces it to an Etruscan word which means pit. So that's... There's something ringing over there that's distracting. Okay, so in this respect, and to some extent, this is true of all the entries of Peter's voluminous catalog, the Speculum Mundi, to me, captures the bookmaker in the process of becoming who he is. This is an ancient dictum in philosophy. I think it starts with Pindar, that your goal in life, or your obligation in life, is to become who you are. The English poet John Donne in 1627, I think, took this a step further, and I recently came across this quote and immediately thought of Peter. John Donne said, "He who desires to print a book should much more desire to be a book." Part of Peter's legacy as a printer is surely to have plumbed in depth all the possibilities of the book, of what a book is and must be. And in his own meditations on the Speculum Mundi, which he shared with me, it hasn't been published yet, but his own ruminations about what he's up to, he quotes Kafka, and maybe you've heard this quote, but I think this also summarizes letterpress book printing. Kafka said, "I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound and stab us. If the book we are reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading it for? But we need the books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be an axe for the frozen sea inside us." And finally, we arrive at the end here, the third branch of philosophy, its only real practical realm, ethics. The question, how should we live? And when Peter and the late Edwin Dobb and several others started the Extraction Project, the fundamental driver was the environmental doom we have created, the way we have fouled our nest, as Jim Harrison put it. If the anthropological age we live in is called the Anthropocene, the so-called age of humans, it seems that we have already entered the twilight of that age. And scientists seem almost universally agreed that an impending climate crisis of apocalyptic proportion looms over us like the sword of Damocles. And to find our way past it, humanity will have to suppress its suicidal tendencies and cultivate other distinctly human impulses, for example, making of art. I know this sounds very hippie in California, but I do believe that part of what's complex about human beings is they do have these destructive tendencies, but also artistic ones. And it seems like so far, for the 5,000 years of recorded history, we've mostly been pursuing the destructive ones. And maybe it takes a climate crisis to wake us up out of it. If we are to not merely endure, but prevail, as Faulkner put it. And so to me, there may be no better laboratory than Montana to conduct this extraction experiment, because Montana is a state accustomed to environmental degradation, a state consumed more and more each summer by forest fire, and a changing climate. And I think Peter's philosophical bookmaking can provide an inspiration for thinking about all of these things, and for thinking about what humanity means and for imagining how we should confront the future. Thank you very much. I hope I left time for questions if that. Did you, questions? Arguments?
So, Aaron, when you mentioned that making a book and being, moving out of the out of the imaginary and into the realm of matter, I mean that's always been the essence of what artists do. And so I think that I'm going to suggest that your dark last words about how maybe the majority of our time on Earth, has been, a lot of destructive stuff. I would say that the power of destruction is so overwhelming that it seems like it's the most dominant thing. We keep noticing the destruction all the time. It's like having sores that you're picking at, or it's like a sore throat that doesn't go away, but it's actually not killing you.
Right.
And I think that the making of art. I mean, just look at this building. Wow. I mean, everything. Most of the things that people do, including medieval castles and manuscripts and factories that make canes for crippled men. That's all really good stuff. And so I think that I know I'm a dark person, but
I didn't mean to overstate. I didn't mean to overstate the darkness at all, and maybe I can mitigate it a little by pointing out that anyone who's ever seen footage of an atomic bomb blast can't deny that is on some level an amazingly beautiful thing if you separate it from the destruction and the poison that it involves. And the same, we just went and looked at the dam on the Great Falls. There's an industrial dam there. And I think on some level, my friend Charlie Rice, who lives here, he likes to go look at the dam, and he says to him, there's a certain beauty to it. So I don't mean to overstate the case that human beings are bad and we need art to save us. But in a sense, it is like that Peter Falk movie, Tune In Tomorrow, where he says, life is a shitstorm, and the only umbrella we have is art. That can be your new motto for the Paris Gibson. Anything else I got wrong? No, I don't want to sound like I'm a gloom guy, because I am pretty optimistic about it. And I think extraction, the whole point of it, on some level, is, I think I fairly said to, thinking, I guess I would put it this way, for me, and I'll speak only for myself. There is an argument to be made that we got to stop global warming or whatever so that we survive as a species, right? But to me, that's not enough. And I don't know if you've seen this movie, Don't Look Up, but it seems pretty clear that no amount of saying we have to stop doing this or we're all going to die is going to solve the problem. And instead, I think what it's going to take is that we need to preserve the environment, not because it keeps us alive, but because it's fun to look at. It's fun to go walk around in the woods. I mean, it's beyond survival, I guess, is what I'm thinking of it. Thank you very much.